Hello and welcome. In this explainer, we're putting on our historical detective hats. Our mission? To figure out what ancient books and burials can actually tell us about societies that vanished thousands of years ago.
It's a pretty wild question, isn't it? How in the world do you listen to people who have been silent for 3,500 years? I mean, they didn't leave behind any tweets or diaries for us to read, but they did leave behind clues.
And we're going to follow two main trails of evidence. First, we've got their powerful words, which were passed down through generations. And second, we have the silent stories told by the things they left buried in the earth. So let's start with the words.
Okay, so our first clue takes us deep into the world of some of the oldest literature known to humanity. And I want you to remember, these aren't just dusty old texts. They're literally the echoes of ancient voices.
Now, you've probably heard of the Vedas. They're some of the oldest books on the planet. A huge collection of hymns, prayers, and philosophy from ancient India. You can almost think of them as a spiritual and cultural toolkit for a society that existed millennia ago.
But get this, the oldest of these texts, the Rig Veda, wasn't a book at all to begin with. For centuries, it was a living, breathing tradition that was composed, memorized, and passed down from teacher to student purely through sound. It was only written down much, much later. Just imagine that.
And you know, these weren't just boring religious texts. This quote actually comes from a hymn that's a dialogue between a wise man and two rivers he needs to cross. He's literally pleading with them, asking them to lower their waters so his chariots can get through safely. It's so poetic, but also super practical, and it gives us this incredible snapshot of their world.
These hymns are absolute treasure troves of clues about their society. The constant mentions of horses and cows, that tells us these animals were incredibly valuable. People were praying for them and for sons. The texts also say that the people who wrote them called themselves Aryas, and they called their opponents Dasas or Dasyus, which suggests a world full of different cultural groups.
All right, now let's switch gears and look at our second set of clues. Because while all those hymns were being composed up in the Northwest, a totally different story was unfolding elsewhere. We're going from spoken words to silent stones. So yeah, the story really shifts here. In places like the Deccan, South India, and even Kashmir, people started building these massive stone structures to mark where they buried their dead. It became a huge practice, telling a parallel story, not with words, but with architecture.
The name kind of says it all, right? Mega means big, and lith means stone, so these megaliths were basically giant headstones. Sometimes they were arranged in huge circles, other times it was just one massive boulder. But they all sent the same signal: somebody important is buried here.
And creating one of these was a massive community project. Seriously, just try to imagine quarrying, shaping, and then hauling these enormous boulders without any modern tools. The sheer amount of effort tells you that these burials were incredibly important social and religious events for them.
What archaeologists find inside these graves is just as revealing. They've uncovered all sorts of things: unique pottery, iron weapons, beautiful ornaments made of stone and gold, and even the skeletons of horses buried right alongside their riding gear. These were clearly very valuable possessions, meant to go with the dead into the afterlife.
So this brings up a really important question. If some people were buried with gold and weapons and even horses, but other graves had way less, what does that tell us about their society? Well, it points directly to social differences, to some kind of hierarchy.
To dig into this idea of social status a little more, let's zoom in on a specific archaeological site in what is now Maharashtra. It's a place called Inamgaon.
Inamgaon was a settlement on the river Gode, and people lived there for almost 1,000 years. Archaeologists found that most adults there were buried in a pretty standard way, laid straight in the ground with their heads pointing north. But they found one major exception.
One man was buried in a completely different way. He was placed in a cross-legged position inside a giant, four-legged clay jar, right in the courtyard of a 5-roomed house. And the fact that this was one of the biggest houses at the entire site, it strongly suggests this was a very high-status person, maybe even the chief.
So the stuff in the graves and the burial styles tell us a lot, but the skeletons themselves, they hold even more secrets. And with modern science, we can learn an incredible amount just by studying the bones they left behind.
This also shows you how much our methods have improved over time. Back in the day, an archaeologist might have found a skeleton with jewelry and just assumed it was a woman. But now we know that men wore ornaments too. The modern and much more reliable method is to look at the bone structure itself. For example, the female pelvis is generally wider to allow for childbirth. That's a clear biological marker that assumptions just can't replace.
360. What on earth could this number mean? Well, it's a count of something really important, from a text written almost 2,000 years ago.
And this is where our two types of clues, books and bones, come together perfectly. About 2,000 years ago, a famous physician named Charaka wrote this incredible medical text, the Charaka Samhita, and in it, he claimed the human body has 360 bones. Now we count 206, but that's because Charaka was including teeth, joints, and cartilage in his total. It's a truly remarkable piece of ancient science, preserved for us in writing.
And that's really the key takeaway here. When we combine the hymns from the Rig Veda, the medical knowledge of Charaka, the silent stones of the megaliths, and the strange burials at Inam Gan, a much richer, more detailed picture of the past starts to form. The words give us their beliefs and their ideas, and the physical remains show us how they actually lived, died, and honored each other.
Which leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Imagine archaeologists thousands of years from now digging up our world. What will our digital files, our books, and all our stuff, our burials, tell them about us? What are the stories that we're leaving behind for them to piece together?